I wanted to make a Halloween video, and I know that it's November, but I started writing this right after the Freeman video when it was still October, so technically this counts as a Halloween video. Also, I got the spooky lighting and everything, man. This is very Halloweeny. This is very spooky. So, yeah. And also, I wanted an excuse to talk about Peak, so let's talk about Peak. If you're even remotely interested in gaming, you've probably heard of Castlevania. And if you haven't, well, shit, I gotta strap in, I guess. I gotta tell you about it. You gotta know this shit. There's a test later, man. You gotta know this shit, man. Why haven't you been studying for the test? What do you mean you didn't know there was a test? We've had 3 months to study. What have you been doing? Starting all the way back in the 8-bit NES days, Castlevania has grown to become one of the biggest and most influential gaming franchises of all time, spawning multiple sequels and even helping to form the basis of a whole genre. Now, I'm what you'd consider an epic gamer, but admittedly, I've never been a big fan of the games. In total, I've played maybe about 10 minutes of 2 of them, and that's about it. I know virtually nothing about them. But in 2017, Netflix produced an animated Castlevania show written by longtime comic writer Warren Ellis and animated by Powerhouse Animation. And it's Kino, it's absolute cinema. One of my favourite shows of all time, right up there with the Funny Depression Show with robots and the Funny Depression Show in space. It's just so good, it's so good. There are many things about the show that are amazing, from its animation, to its acting, to its writing, to its music, to its writing, to its writing. And honestly, I could yap about all of it until KSI makes a good song. But in this video, I want to specifically talk about its various depictions of grief and how it explores the different ways that grief can affect people. Also, while I'll mainly be looking at the first series, I'll also be covering its awkward younger sibling, Castlevania Nocturne, because why not? Alright, without further ado, let the depression commence, starting with the Big D himself.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets!
I'm a leg. We first meet the laddie boy in episode 1 when a woman named Lisa knocks on his door looking to learn some shit. You see, she wants to be a doctor and help people with science as opposed to drinking Suika. I know, it is Romania. And the D-Meister has a bunch of cool books and gizmos that were lost to time because people in the 15th century have chronic stupid disease. So they had their little meet cute, do a little flirting. He agrees to teach her what he knows, and she decides to help him learn more about humanity. Ah, that's really sweet. They seem really nice together. I hope their relationship turns out well. God fucking damn it. So yeah, the whole inciting incident is Lisa, who is now married to the old VDT, gets accused of witchcraft and is burnt at the stake because church moment, bottom text. Which understandably pisses our sweet transvestite right off. There are many depictions of vampires in media. Some are monstrous, some are lesbians, some are angsty soft boys who date high schoolers. But if I were to describe this version of Dracula, it would be biblically accurate. And when he finds out that Lisa is dead, he pulls out all the stops. I'm talking raining blood, I'm talking army of night creatures, I'm talking making his face show up and shit. The whole works. But after that initial outburst, he just kind of deflates, confining himself to his cozy little fireside chair and letting all of his generals do the genociding. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention he's genociding the entire human race in retaliation for Lisa's death. Now, originally I was gonna try and relate this to the 5 stages of grief thing, but the truth is, grief is a lot more simple than that. You can't just condense it down to 5 easy to digest nibbles. And as someone who did recently experience grief, I'd say this show has a much more realistic example. Because grief doesn't work in stages, it rips through you all at once while paradoxically poisoning you bit by bit. Sure, you might feel an initial rush of emotion where you cry and cheer and pierce and come, but once that's all over, it just kind of drains you, man. Which is exactly what we see happen to Dracula. Even the other vampires in his court can tell something's off. From their perspective, they're seeing this great leader, this massive figure in their community, devolve into a husk. And they're not too far off. The Dracula, he's lost the only person he ever truly cared about. And sure, he's made his vow, and he does plan to see that through. But outside of the broad strokes of kill the humans, nothing really matters to him. He doesn't care about the finer details, he just wants it done. But of course, there are the wider implications of such a plan. Vampires feed on humans, so once you kill all the humans, what are the vampires gonna eat? It's only a matter of time before the vampires all die from hunger. And to an extent, that's Dracula's intention. He isn't just really sad, he straight up doesn't want to live anymore. To quote the show, this whole genocide is history's longest suicide note. So it carries on like this, with the other vampires questioning Dracula's whole deal and Dracula himself being less sad on his chair. And it's not until the end of season 2, when he fights the show's main trio, that we see a glimpse of what he was like in his prime. And holy shit, bro is a force of nature. We've seen some pretty formidable monsters up until this point, but Dracky Boy makes all of them look like chump change. That is, until he almost kills his son, Alucard, who is trying to stop him. It's a whole thing we'll get into later. At which point he snaps back to reality, and the gravity of what he's doing finally starts to set in. At the end of the day, he still loves Alucard almost as much as he loved Lisa, but he was so blinded by his grief and his rage, he couldn't see just how far he had gone in his crusade to kill all the humans. So having realized what he's doing, he relents, letting Alucard stake him and finally joining his wife. This is hands down one of, if not the best depictions of grief I've ever seen. Like I said, grief acts like a poison, corroding you and weighing you down over time. And in the case of Dracula, I think this series does an amazing job at showcasing that experience. But grief can affect people in all sorts of different ways. And even if two people are affected in relatively similar ways, the way that they can react to that grief can be wildly different. And a good example of this would be...
You must be the Belmont.
We first meet Trevor at the tail end of episode 1, right after Dracula goes full Griffith. And Trevor to me is interesting, because his story isn't too dissimilar from Dracula's. Trevor's family, the Belmonts, were a dynasty of monster hunters and vampire slayers, protecting the people of Wallachia for centuries. But like how they persecuted Lisa, the church one day just turned around and said, how do you know so much about monsters? I smell witchcraft. Burning down Trevor's family home, orphaning him at the ripe old age of 14, 13, maybe 12. So he grew up wandering around by himself, carrying that grief with him for years. And like Dracula, he doesn't really care about other humans. However, he is still a Belmont, and that arguably is what sets him apart from Dracula. Because he still has that legacy and that pride in his family name, he still has a reason to fight, to keep going, and something to stop him from completely decaying away the way Dracula did. And although he does the whole "I don't care what happens to people" thing, he is at his core a man who can't just stand by while innocent people get hurt. And that's a side of him we see gently coaxed out of him as the series goes on. Which starts when Trevor runs into a group of Jewish Romani, speakers, a nomadic people who travel from town to town, giving aid to those in need and passing their history down to oral tradition. Basically, they settled in a town that believes they're responsible for the nightly night creature raids. Probably because the town's bishop is the same guy who who organised Lisa's burning at the stake. It's probably because it's that fucking dumbass. Trevor's fine with just passing through and letting everyone get eaten, but the Belmonts have always had a good relationship with speakers, and he empathises with them because he too is on the church's shit list. So he tries to convince them to leave before the town's bishop can whip up a pogrom and have them killed. But they won't go because their leader's grandchild is missing, having gone into the town's underground catacombs to look for a mythical messiah sleeping under the town. Which, spoiler alert, turns out to be Alucard, guys. That's how they meet Alucard. Oh my god. So Trevor goes down there expecting to find a corpse, but instead finds Cypher, his future love interest. Some other stuff happens. The speakers still won't go, which frustrates the fuck out of Trevor because he'd sooner just let them all be eaten. They're fucking assholes anyway. But through the influence of Cypher and the other speakers, he actually ends up helping the townsfolk, arming them and leading them against the latest attack of night creatures. This, I think, is a really important moment for Trevor. Because of what happened to his family, he's closed himself off from other people, which is a very common response to that sort of trauma, and also very similar to a certain other character we were talking about earlier. Gee, I wonder who that is. But in this scene, we see him get to really stretch his monster hunting muscles and use those skills to help other people, not just himself. And more than that, these are the same people he was so ready to abandon in the first place, but now he's helping them, which, it shows that he's making progress, shows that he's moving on. After that, Trevor and Cypher link up with the sleeping messiah person who turns out to be Alucard. What? It's not like I was saying that earlier. What? Huh? And the team free up to stop Alucard. To stop Alucard? Release me!
Release me!
The three team up to stop Dracula's whole human genocide thing. And from then on, we see Trevor soften up a bit and learn to work better with other people, which Alucard definitely contributes to, but I would say that Trevor's progress is thanks in large part to Cypher's influence. The relationship between Trevor and Cypher is sweet but very subtle. There's no big I love you confession scene with a 5-minute makeout session and a big orchestral score in the background. You just see them very organically go from friends to lovers to having a kid, and it's nice, they're good together. And in season 3 especially, you can see that being with Cypher is good for Trevor. He cracks more jokes, is more open to helping people in general, and honestly just seems happier with her. Granted, this does change a bit in season 4 when things get a bit more dire again, but my point is sometimes when we experience a great loss or betrayal or both, it's common to react by secluding yourself. And even if it's not as extreme as, say, attempting genocide, it can still be very unhealthy to close yourself off like that. And while there are many ways you can work through that, sometimes it's really as simple as finding someone else to rely on, someone you can open up to, someone who can remind you that not everyone is an asshole, and you don't have to completely close yourself off. But sometimes we might not be able to grieve. Sometimes there might be something else that's taking up the energy and time that we could otherwise use to address that grief. And in Castlevania, a prime example of that is my main man.
Ah, the return of the Y-boner, with a vengeance.
Of all of our main trio, Alucard is probably the most determined to kill Dracula. But while the other characters see it as a pretty cut and dry case of finding and killing a genocidal maniac, to Alucard, it's a tragedy. Dracula isn't just a bloodthirsty monster, he's a scholar, an intellectual. A man who, between himself and his castle, holds centuries worth of knowledge. Knowledge that could have helped the world. And if Lisa's death hadn't proved right, all of his worst instincts about humanity, her efforts to humanize him might have worked. But now Alucard's father is on the warpath, and it's his mother's people who are suffering for it. So for Alucard, the choice is obvious. In order to honor his mother, his father has to die. And I want to be clear, this isn't something he wants to do, this is something he feels he has to do. He takes no enjoyment out of finding and killing his own father, but if it means saving humanity, then so be it. And even if he does bicker and banter a bit with Trevor and Cypher, mostly Trevor, most of his mind is preoccupied with the single drive to do his mission, to do the one thing that he's set out to do. And after some stuff involving Trevor's old family home and the Belmont hold, the collective knowledge of all the Belmonts, yada yada yada, we don't really have time for that, Cypher manages to cast a spell trapping Dracula's castle, which by the way can move. I forgot to mention that.
Where did you land the castle, Cypher?
Right on top of us.
Oh no!
Trevor, Alucard, Cypher, they all go into the castle, they fight Dracula, and after the big fight, ending in Dracula's death, Trevor and Cypher decide to travel around and help others, leaving Alucard alone to protect both the knowledge inside the castle and the knowledge inside the Belmont hold. But now that he's done what he set out to achieve, all those emotions, all that grief that he's been keeping bottled up inside him starts to wash over him, and now that Trevor and Cypher are gone, he has no one to talk to. He's all by himself in this massive castle, alone. But in a way, this isolation he puts himself through is a punishment. He feels guilty for having killed his father, so he locks himself away as a form of penance. And that seems to change in season 3 when he meets Sumi and Taka. They give him a whole spiel being like, we want to be better monster hunters, please teach us. But spoiler alert, they turn out to be massive fucking assholes. Like, they really traumatized my boy. And it sucks because before the betrayal, they were kind of good for him. He finally had someone to talk to, finally could put all that knowledge he's got into good use. He was starting to heal. And then they have a threesome with him, and when he's at his most vulnerable, they try to kill him because they're hell-bent on learning how to move the castle, even though Cypher fucking broke it, and they won't believe him when he says they can't move the castle because they're convinced that he's keeping shit from them. So he's forced to kill them. And it's wild, I know, it's wild. And I hate this scene so much, but I can't get into it. Otherwise this video will be 4 hours long. But understandably, this betrayal sets our boy way back. Like, way back. And he ends up doing the old Dracula special and leaving their bodies on stakes outside the castle, which, by the way, dead old dad used to do. Thankfully, he gets some respite in season 4 when he meets Greta, the leader of a small town beset by night creatures. And we kind of get a good ending version of what happened in season 3. In order to protect the town, Alucard brings them to his castle for better security, and after the finale where he reunites with Trevor and Cypher and they work together to fight the personification of death, it's a whole thing, don't worry about it. Alucard ends up founding a village with these people right outside the castle, and it leads to a whole new generation of people living in and around the castle. And no longer will this castle be an omen of death and destruction. It's now a place where people can build and grow and learn. What's interesting to me about Alucard's story is that while he does isolate himself in grief, much like Dracula and Trevor, he even compares himself to Trevor a few times. Killing Dracula, defending the castle, these are things that he never wanted to do, but rather things that he believed he had to, either out of duty, penance, or in the memory of someone else. And I believe that deep down what he really wants is a place to belong. He wants a family. And we see that, we see him make a conceited effort to change his isolation, to change his circumstance, and find people he can rely on, even if it's thrown back in his face. But losing someone doesn't always mean they're dead. Sometimes friendships and relationships can just go sour, or sometimes circumstances are going to make it so we can't be near the people we care about. And although those people are still kicking, we can still experience a form of grief, mourning the relationship we once had, which might motivate us to try and recapture the way things were, which can change us for better and for worse.
I'm extremely famous and they wanted to meet someone who'd seen toilet paper.
What the fuck is toilet paper?
Okay, so the 5 stages of grief are bullshit, right? But if we were to apply them to the characters we've discussed so far, then Dracula is probably anger, Trevor is acceptance, and Alucard is my depressed king. I love him so much. Well, keeping to that model, I'd say that Saint Germain is pretty much the personification of bargaining. Even though the person he lost technically isn't dead, but we'll get into that. We first meet Saint Germain in Season 3, and I instantly liked him because he's played by Bill Nye, not the science guy. He was in the Cornetto trilogy, he played Davy Jones, and was the villain in Detective Pikachu? What? But my glazing of the actor initially blinded me to the fact that this character is a fucking asshole, even becoming a main antagonist in Season 4, getting roped into a whole plot to resurrect Dracula. But what's this guy's deal anyway? Well, apparently he's actually based on a real life guy who's theorized to be a time traveler. Well, actually he's based on the guy in the game, based on the guy in real... It doesn't matter, don't worry about it. In the show, he's a diplomat, a scholar. He's a bootlicker. He's a professional bootlicker. He goes around giving premium grade rim jobs to all the major aristocracy in Europe and beyond. But he is very learned and knows a fair bit of alchemy. Nope, not that alchemy, not different alchemy. And in his travels, he falls in love with a character they don't name. We'll call her Selena, she looks like a Selena. So together, Saint Germain and his waifu for lifeu figure out how to access the Infinite Corridor, a sort of interdimensional plane that allows you to access different universes. That's right, Castlevania did the whole multiverse thing before Marvel beat it over our heads. Although it's kind of a mess in this as well, but shut up, it's still pink, it's still good. But their little trip goes awry and the two are separated, with Selena lost in the Infinite Corridor and Saint Germain stuck in our normal, boring, gross world. So how does he react? Does he accept his loss, learn to move on? No, he doesn't do that. He very much doesn't. He works to reunite with her to the point of obsession and ends up accidentally making a deal with death and almost ending the world. So yeah, Saint Germain is a fucking idiot whose fatal flaw was that he was so arrogant, so self-absorbed, that he couldn't even consider the possibility that Selena was gone and that he needed to move on. He wouldn't let himself grieve, and it turned himself into a monster. That's basically all I gotta say about the OG series, but I said I was gonna talk about Nocturne, so I'm gonna talk about Nocturne. You can't stop me. I'm doing it, it's too late. And I also gotta mention another thing.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
In 2020, it was alleged and then confirmed that Warren Ellis, the creator and lead writer of Castlevania, had sexually coerced and manipulated over 60 women, most of them fans. I'm not too knowledgeable on the situation. There's an article I'll link in the description which goes into more detail, but after it all came out, Ellis was fired from all the projects he was working on at the time, which was a few Image comics, I think a Batman comic, and of course, Castlevania. This goes without saying, but this is disgusting behaviour, and while I still recommend the show and hold it in very high regard, I wouldn't blame anyone for hearing about these allegations and being turned off from watching it. It's just a shame that something so amazing is attached to such a disgusting piece of shit. Since Season 4 was set to be the final season anyway, and Ellis had already finished writing for it, not much could be done. But going forward, he would be completely barred from anything Castlevania related, leaving TV writer Clive Bradley to take over as lead writer for the sequel series, Castlevania Nocturne, which took place over 300 years after the original. You like what I did there? I changed the colour of the light because the original is all red, but Nocturne is all blue, so I made it blue. Nocturne for me is a bit of a mixed bag, but to make a long short. I think it's pretty good actually. It's pretty well written. It just has a few weak spots and overall kind of lacks the original's sauce, you know, lacks the sauce. However, a character that the writing definitely doesn't let down is Olrox. Oh, and the main character Richter, I guess, but I just really like Olrox, okay? I just really like him. We first meet Richter in episode 1 when Olrox fucking kills his mother in front of him. Holy trauma, Batman. Olrox lets Richter go, even sympathizing with him, explaining that he killed Richter's mum because she killed someone he loved. But after that, Richter flees to France right in time for the revolution, boys, let's go! And is raised by a friend of his mum's, Terra, alongside her daughter Maria. So he grows up to be this hotshot monster hunter in a small town killing small-time vampires, and oh, look at me, I'm amazing, I can whip things real good and throw knives. But without another Belmont to show him the ropes, his skills kind of plateau. But something that's rather crucial is that ever since his mother died, he's been unable to do magic, which is something that every Belmont inherited from Cypher. Plus, he's very reluctant to really get into the grief and trauma of his mother dying, which is fine, I guess. Like I said, all the vampires he kills are relatively small time, so he's fine just whipping things and throwing knives at shit. He's Richter, man. He's a Belmont. Way. But then the plot happens, and Richter comes face to face with Olrox once again, which he responds to by bricking and legging it in that order. See, the reason he's not properly addressed his mother's death is because he didn't want to face one simple fact. He was afraid. Sure, he has a lot of bravado, but because he's never had any serious challenge or strife, he's perfectly happy to let his potential stagnate and ignore all that trauma, because it's only when we confront these difficult emotions that we can move on from them. So when he sees Olrox, the personification of his nightmares, of his worst fears, he just runs, completely legs it. Then he bumps into Juiced? His grandfather, who's been secretly keeping an eye on him ever since he came to France. And Richter finds that Juiced is much like he is. He's lost his magic due to a great loss, and because he refuses to properly address that loss and work through it, his skills have stagnated. The only difference is that Richter is a young man with his life still ahead of him, and Juiced is an old man who's way past his prime and still stuck in the past. This, to spell it out, is a not so subtle nod to Richter of what he could become if he stays on the path that he's currently on. And while they chat, they're ambushed by vampires, sent to kill Richter, who restrain him and get ready to do the deed. And now Richter is in the same position he was when he was 10. Alone, trapped, and afraid. But this time he doesn't run or freeze. This time he makes a choice. He lets go of the family he lost and chooses to focus and fight for the family he has now, i.e. a bunch of characters that I didn't talk about yet, but that's okay because I'm talking about Richter. I'm talking about Richter right now. Those guys don't matter, okay? But all that self-actualization and moving on from the trauma gets him his magic back. Way! And he proceeds to throw all of the hands, killing his would-be executioner. And because he's no longer running away from his trauma, he's no longer afraid of Olrox and is able to grow into his full potential, becoming the only character so far who's even remotely processed his grief in a healthy way. Jeez fucking Louise. It's almost as if that's a good thing. Who would have thunk it? If you made it this far into the video, you're probably wondering what the point of all my yapping is. And to that I say, something 5 stages of grief. But you might have noticed too that a few of these characters all have one thing in common, and that's that when they are faced with grief, they isolate themselves, whether by their own doing or by circumstance. Which tends to be the unifying trait of grief. It isolates and makes you alone even when you have a whole network of friends. And while it's easier said than done, the trick is to remember those people, to remember the world outside your grief. But at the same time, it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to process it however you need to process it, as long as you don't completely let it blind and poison you. And at the end of the day, I think that's the nature of grief. It's paradoxical. It does one thing while simultaneously doing a completely different thing. All this to say, I think Castlevania and Castlevania Nocturne handled this subject masterfully. Whether it's lowly mortals or godlike vampire lords, each example is written in a way that's realistic and full of depth and gives sympathy to even the worst characters. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider doing the standard YouTube stick of like, comment, yada yada. The show legit means so much to me, so it's a real treat being able to talk about it like this. Even if I don't know much about the source material, I'm saying you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.